Welcome back to the Bluffton News. We are now going to head out to reporter Kevin Libby, who had a very special sit-down with Congressman Mark Sanford.
Thank you, Annalisa. Indeed, we are joined by our Congressman, Mark Sanford. Mark, thank you for joining us on the broadcast.
My pleasure.
So we have a little bit of federal legislation to talk about. I'm very excited.
Yeah, there's a lot that's been going on in Washington. Some tied to legislation, some tied to a bit of a food fight up in the big city.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we're familiar with, we covered on the station, is this Bigger to Waters flood insurance reformation bill. This does away with a lot of subsidies for people who have coastal property. Plenty of that here in the first. Tell me how you approach that.
I approach it, I think, fairly sensibly, which is you never put the cart before the horse. And I think that the Bigger Waters bill does, so much so that Maxine Waters, who was one of the original authors, has said, wait a minute, we do need to do a timeout on this one. And so there's a reform piece of legislation that I've signed on to that simply says timeout. Timeout until, one, you've first actually done the flood maps. I mean, because what was going to take place was government will charge you a new premium, a higher premium, without showing us the black box, if you will, as to how they got there and how they derived that premium.
Sure.
It seems reasonable to say, wait a minute, if you're going to have a new premium, show us how you get there. They weren't able to do that because they didn't yet have flood maps established. They hadn't laid out all of their assumptions in coming up with new rate premiums. And so this bill simply slows down the clock to say, wait a minute, get your ducks in a row. Let's see what the flood maps look like, what they include, what they don't include. Let's look at your assumptions. Is a storm going to hit on a high tide? How many storms a year? How robust is the storm? What kind of winds are you projecting? Because those kinds of analytics make all the difference in the world, only in terms of the premium that is derived.
It dictates costs, absolutely.
Yeah, and so I think it's a central reform bill that simply says, show us your numbers. What was the Jerry Maguire movie, Show Me the Money? It basically says to the federal government, show us your numbers before we hand a lot of cash.
And bipartisan too, 417-3 the vote on that one, so very popular.
Yeah.
Taking to one that you've actually co-authored, you're authoring this bill to take the Inspector General of the NSA, and the NSA has been all over the news because of, among other things, they were wiretapping Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany. Since 2003 in the Patriot Act, pretty much the government has the right to surveil anything changeable. So
yeah, well, that's the big question, though, is do they have the right, or is it a taken prerogative? In this case, it's a taken prerogative, because...
And you want someone to be accountable for...
Yeah, I mean, Jim Sensenbrenner, who was one of the original authors of the Patriot Act, has said, wait a minute, this is not at all what Congress envisioned. You guys have gone a bit rogue here and have basically presumed a lot of consent that really wasn't there from the Congress. So he actually has a reform bill that he's come out with, I've signed on to, and there are different pieces of reform that are all about basically putting NSA back in a contained box, and one of which I've offered, which is to say, wait a minute, rather than having the Inspector General come within your chain of command so that the Inspector General works for the boss of the agency.
They can fire him.
Let's have somebody outside of your chain of command looking in over the hood.
Maybe the highest command there is, the executive branch of the United States.
To us, that makes sense. It's what we have now in place with the Department of Homeland Security, CIA, Defense Department, and a variety of other departments. Why shouldn't it apply to NSA as well?
So let's shift gears a little bit. You have two committee assignments now. You're on transportation, and you're also on Homeland Security, not the Department of, but the Homeland Security Committee. One of the things that you've supported was the Joint Strike Fighter. That's the F-35 Lightning II. That's a plane which costs about $90 million, began from Lockheed Martin down the road in Georgia. It costs about $400 million to buy all of them. We're going to have about 200 on either side of the coasts. And it costs about $600 million to maintain them. Excuse me, $600 billion to maintain them. That's about $6,000 per federal taxpayer. So you ran on stopping spending now. Why is it relevant to have this Joint Strike Fighter, which unfortunately, to our knowledge, is not relevant to any global conflict that we're engaged in, here stateside? Why do we have to have 400 of these planes on both coasts?
Well, I think that you hit the operative term with what you said a moment ago, which is any conflict that we're aware of.
Yeah, we don't know about all of them, it seems. I mean, we don't have a peace treaty with North Korea. We've been there since 1950.
Yeah. I mean, the reality of warfare is...
modern warfare.
Yeah, is that you want to be ready for the next conflict. And so what people say is that, Generation 3, tactical fighters, every time will outperform a Generation 2 tactical fighter.
Right, they land vertically, they're faster.
They have stealth in a way that an F-18 or an F-16 doesn't.
And now
so
the Saudis have the F-16 and the F-18 because we sold it to them. So it's not like we have air superiority necessarily.
Yeah, and so this is about transitioning to the next generation of tactical fighter. It's probably the last manned fighter. We'll probably go unmanned.
Fascinating approach.
I suspect after that, I mean, you know, the Star Wars approach of drones is probably the next generation beyond this. But you know, what folks have said, and again, I'm only 5 months in there. I wasn't a part of original votes that, you know, created the Joint Strike Fighter and other platforms. But I do think that there is a lot of merit in saying we have to be prepared technologically and keep the edge, because we don't have the numbers of China or a variety of other people out there around the globe where they've got vastly superior armories in terms of just raw numbers. Our edge has always been technological, and we need to maintain it.
Mark, we only have about 30 seconds left, but very, very quickly, we talked about basically the most important vote you had in the House perhaps was your vote against the continuing resolution to fund the government, which inside 24 hours away from us defaulting on the debt. Was default on the debt a viable possibility for you? And what's our path going forward where we don't have an approved budget and we're operating off of a continuing resolution?
Well, one, there's been a complete breakdown to the budget process since I was last.
Yeah, we're back to normal order though, right?
What's that?
Are we back to normal order?
No, we're operating on a continuing resolution right now, and you know we used
in terms of the budget process for next year.
Yeah. But we used to do authorization appropriation process. That's not the case in Washington D.C. right now, and so I voted as I did because at some point we got to draw a line in the sand in spending as we are. If not, I think we go over the edge at some point with really harmful effect for the dollar, for the future inflation, for really our way of life. I think that there was legitimacy at that point. We were not at the point of default. I mean, there were a lot of scare tactics out there that made it sound like it was the next day. If you actually looked at the number, we were looking at end of month or arguably into the middle of November before we would actually hit that tripwire. So
it wasn't an acceptable option for you to have this default on debt?
I mean, again, I don't think me or anybody else wants to see a default. I mean, that would be cataclysmic. It would be a real problem. And I don't think we were at that point when we took that vote.
Well, Mark, we're out of time, but thank you so much for coming and talking to us, and we hope we can have you again very soon.
Pleasure.
Our Congressman Mark Sanford. Back to you, Annalisa.
On our return, Kim Viljak with the latest entertainment report.